The morning her father decided her fate, he did not knock on her door. He sent the housekeeper instead, with a dress that belonged to no one, a gray wool thing that smelled of cedar and neglect, folded over the woman's arm like an afterthought. Myra stared at it. "Father requests you wear this," the housekeeper said, not meeting her eyes, "for the visit." The visit, that was what they were calling it, as though a duke were simply stopping by for tea, as though her father had not spent the last 3 weeks reorganizing the entire household around this single afternoon, as though Myra had not heard, through walls thin enough to betray every secret this family had ever kept, exactly what kind of arrangement was being discussed. She put on the dress, not because she was obedient, not because she was afraid, because she wanted to see, with her own eyes, what her father was willing to do. She did not look in the mirror before she left the room. She looked at her hand instead, at the small gold ring on her fourth finger, the one her mother had pressed into her palm 11 years ago, 3 days before she died, with instructions so quiet Myra had leaned in close to hear them. "Don't let him take this. Whatever else he takes, and he will take things, my darling, don't let him have this." Myra had kept that promise. Her father had never once looked at her hand long enough to notice. That, she would later think, was where he made his mistake. The Duke noticed in 11 seconds. The Duke of Harwick arrived at 2:30, which was precisely when he said he would arrive. Myra noted this from the upstairs window, the black carriage, the crest on the door, the way the footman outside straightened without being told. Power, she had learned, did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply entered a room and rearranged everything in it without touching a single object. She came downstairs when she was called, not before. Her father was waiting in the entrance hall, flanked by her older sister Cecily, who wore pale blue silk and had her hair arranged in a style that must have taken 2 hours and 3 opinions. Cecily was everything Lord Ashwell wanted her to be: beautiful in the way that made men feel comfortable, accomplished in the ways that showed in a drawing room, and clever enough to hide how clever she actually was. Myra loved her sister. She did not always understand her. Lord Ashwell looked at Myra when she appeared at the bottom of the stairs, and something moved across his face. Satisfaction, she thought. The particular satisfaction of a man whose plan is going exactly as intended. "There you are," he said, as though she were slightly late. She was not. "Stand here." He placed her to the side, not beside Cecily, not in the center of the entrance where the light came through the tall windows and made everything look better than it was. To the side, near the wall, in the shadow of the curtain, where the gray dress disappeared into the gray afternoon and Myra herself might have been mistaken for part of the furniture. She understood then, fully, without any remaining doubt. He was not presenting her. He was hiding her in plain sight, making her available enough to satisfy the Duke's stated terms, while ensuring that the moment the Duke saw Cecily, the choice would make itself. It was, she admitted privately, not an unintelligent plan. The Duke walked in. He was taller than she had imagined, which was irritating because she had specifically tried not to imagine him at all. Dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had probably caused a considerable amount of trouble over the years, not because it was soft or pretty, but because it was certain. The face of a man who had decided something a long time ago and had not been given adequate reason to change his mind since. He greeted her father. He greeted Cecily. He said the correct things in the correct order, and Myra watched him do it the way she watched everything, quietly, from a distance, filing information away. And then he turned. Not toward the center of the room, not toward Cecily, who was positioned with the chandelier light falling across her at an angle their father had almost certainly calculated in advance. Toward the wall, toward the shadow, toward Myra. His eyes moved to her face first, a brief assessment, neither warm nor unkind, and then, without any particular hurry, dropped to her hand. They stayed there. Myra did not move. The Duke's expression did not change exactly, but something behind it did. Something shifted, a door opening somewhere far back in a house that had been locked for a long time. When he looked up again, he was looking only at her. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said. Her father's smile flickered, just once, just slightly. "My younger daughter," Lord Ashwell said, with the careful lightness of a man diffusing something he didn't know was explosive. "Myra, she is." "Where did you get that ring?" The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a pause in conversation. The different kind, the kind that happens when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, when a question has been asked that everyone present suddenly understands is not a small question at all. Myra looked at the Duke. The Duke looked at her hand. Her father looked at both of them with the expression of a man watching a plan. He was quite proud to fold itself quietly in half. "It was my mother's," Myra said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that. "Your mother," the Duke repeated. Not a question, more like a man placing a word carefully down on a table to look at it properly. "What was her name?" "Anne," Myra said. "Anne Voss before she married." The silence that followed was a different kind again. The Duke looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way almost no one had looked at her in 11 years, and then he did something she had not anticipated. He said, very quietly so that only she could hear it, "She gave you that herself, didn't she?" It was not a question either. Myra's heart did something complicated. "Yes," she said. The Duke straightened, turned to her father, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed in a way that Lord Ashwell, Myra could see, did not yet understand was very bad news for him. "I wonder," the Duke said pleasantly, "if I might sit down." They sat in the blue drawing room, the good one, the one her father reserved for people whose opinions had financial consequences. Lord Ashwell had arranged the seating before the Duke arrived. Cecily beside the window, naturally. The small settee angled toward the fireplace where the light was best, positioned so that anyone sitting across from it would find their eye drawn there first. It was a room arranged like an argument, and Lord Ashwell had made sure he knew where every piece stood. The Duke sat where he liked. He chose the chair closest to the door, not the most comfortable, not the most flattering, and he angled it slightly so that he could see everyone in the room without turning his head. It was the smallest of adjustments. Myra doubted anyone else noticed. She noticed. She had taken a seat near the far end of the room at the edge of things, as she usually did. Her father had not told her to. It was simply where she had learned to put herself over the years, close enough to observe, far enough to be overlooked. It was a position that had taught her a great deal. Tea was brought. Cecily poured with practiced grace. Lord Ashwell spoke about the estate, about the season, about several things that had nothing to do with what was actually happening in the room. He was good at this, filling air with words until the air itself felt solid, felt safe, felt like nothing sharp could move through it. The Duke listened. He responded when required. He was, on the surface, perfectly agreeable, but his eyes kept returning to Myra's hand, not constantly, not obviously. Just returning, the way a person's tongue finds a loose tooth, involuntary, specific. Myra kept her hand still in her lap and waited. It was Cecily who finally broke the pattern, the way Cecily always did, not out of nervousness, but out of a genuine desire to make things easier for everyone, which was both her greatest kindness and the thing that occasionally made her useful to people who did not deserve it. "Your Grace," she said, with a smile that had opened more doors than most keys, "I understand you have been traveling. Was the road from London difficult?" "Manageable," the Duke said, and then without transition, without the social softening that the question deserved, "Miss Myra." Myra looked up. "Tell me about your mother." The teacup in Lord Ashwell's hand made a small sound against its saucer. Cecily blinked once, recovered, and looked at her own hands. Myra looked at the Duke steadily. "What would you like to know?" "Anything you're willing to say." It was, she thought, an unusual answer. Most people who asked about her mother wanted a specific thing, confirmation of a story they already had, a detail that would fit neatly into what they believed. The Duke asked as though he genuinely did not know what he was looking for yet. She was kind, Myra said. She was educated, though she didn't speak about it often. She read in 3 languages. She kept a garden that she tended herself, which people thought was eccentric. She paused. She died when I was 9. Of what? Fever. She watched his face. It was fast. She was gone in less than a week. Something crossed the Duke's expression, not pity, she thought. Something older than pity. And the ring, he said. She gave it to you before she died. 3 days before. Did she tell you where it came from? Myra held his gaze. She said it was given to her by a friend, someone she trusted more than almost anyone. She said the ring had belonged to that friend's family for a long time, and that it was given freely, and that I should wear it and not explain it to people who wouldn't understand. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Did she give you a name? She did, Myra said. Margaret. The effect was immediate and complete. The Duke set down his teacup. He did it carefully, deliberately, the way a person moves when they are managing something interior that they have no intention of letting into the room. His jaw tightened once and then released. Lord Ashwell was watching this exchange with the expression of a man who has walked into a room he thought he knew and found the walls in different places. Margaret, the Duke repeated. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, more to himself than to anyone present, She never told me. I beg your pardon, Lord Ashwell said. The Duke turned to him, and whatever had been briefly visible in his face was gone now, replaced by something more formal, more measured, more dangerous in the particular way that controlled things are always more dangerous than open ones. Margaret was my mother's name, he said. The room absorbed this. Cecily looked at Myra. Myra did not look away from the Duke. Your mother and mine, Myra said slowly, knew each other. More than that, I think. He glanced at the ring again. That ring has been in my family for 4 generations. My mother told me she had given it away, that she had given it to someone who needed it more than we did, someone who had been very dear to her. She would not say who. He paused. She cried when she said it. My mother was not a woman who cried easily. The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, the afternoon had turned gray and close, the kind of light that flattened everything and made the world feel smaller than it was. Myra looked down at her hand, at the small gold ring, worn thin at the band from 11 years of wearing, warm against her skin the way only things that have been held a long time become warm. Her mother had pressed it into her palm and whispered, "Don't let him take this," and Myra had spent 11 years not understanding fully why it mattered so much. Only that it did. Only that her mother's voice when she said it had been the most serious her mother had ever sounded, the most urgent, the most certain. She understood now that her mother had known something. She understood now that the ring was not simply a ring. Your Grace, she said, and her voice was still steady, which she was grateful for because the rest of her was not. What else did your mother tell you about this woman she had given it to? The Duke looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, something careful and something older underneath the careful, something that had been waiting in a locked room for a long time and had just heard a key in the door. She told me, he said, that if I ever met a woman wearing that ring, I was to pay attention. Silence. Lord Ashwell made a sound that was not quite a word. The Duke did not look at him. He looked at Myra. I am paying attention, he said. He left an hour later. No agreement had been reached. No terms had been discussed. Lord Ashwell had attempted twice to steer the conversation back toward practical matters. The debt, the estate, the arrangement that had brought the Duke here in the first place. And both times the Duke had listened politely and then simply continued doing whatever he had been doing before, which was asking Myra questions. Not inappropriate questions, not intimate ones. Small things on the surface. Had she read much? Did she speak French? Had she ever been to London? The kind of questions a person asks when they are building something in their mind and need more material. Myra answered them. She didn't know why exactly. She was not generally a person who gave things easily, but he asked as though her answers mattered, and that was rare enough to be disarming. When he stood to leave, he thanked Lord Ashwell for his hospitality. He told Cecily it had been a pleasure. And then he turned to Myra, and he said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with that same locked-room expression. And then he said, "I hope we will speak again soon." Not a question, not quite a promise, something in between. Myra said, "Perhaps." It was the most non-committal word she owned. She deployed it carefully. The Duke almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before it disappeared. And then he was gone, and the door closed, and Lord Ashwell turned to her with an expression she had seen before, the particular expression of a man whose plan has failed in a way he cannot yet fully account for, and who needs somewhere to put that. He found somewhere. "You spoke out of turn," he said. "You asked me nothing," Myra said, "so I answered what I was asked." "He came here for Cecily." Then he should have looked at Cecily. It was the wrong thing to say. She knew it when she said it. Cecily made a small sound and looked at the window, and Lord Ashwell's face went the particular shade of red that meant the conversation was over because he was ending it. "Go to your room," he said. Myra went. She did not stay there. She waited until the house settled into its evening sounds. The cook in the kitchen, her father in his study with his brandy and his ledgers, Cecily's maid moving quietly above, and then she went to the place she always went when she needed to think. Her mother's old sitting room, the one her father had not touched, not because he was sentimental but because it was small and north-facing and not useful for anything else, and so it had simply been left, the books still on the shelf, the writing desk still by the window, the faint smell of the lavender her mother had kept in small sachets in every drawer. Myra sat at the desk and looked at the ring. Don't let him take this. She had always assumed her mother meant her father. That made sense. Her father took things not violently, not dramatically, but persistently, the way water takes a riverbank. Over years, over small moments. Until one day you looked around and found that the shape of your life had changed and you could not point to exactly when. But now she thought, what if she had also meant something else? What if the warning was not only about the ring itself, but about what the ring carried, what it meant, what it could reveal in the right hands to the right person? What if her mother had known somehow that this moment would come? She opened the desk drawer. She was not sure what she was looking for. She had been through this desk before, years ago, and found nothing of significance, old letters, receipts, a small sketchbook with drawings of the garden. But she had been 9 when she looked, and 14 when she looked again, and she was 20 now, and the things a person notices at 20 are different. She took everything out, set it on the desktop in the thin evening light. The letters first. She had read them before in correspondence with a dressmaker, notes from neighbors, one long letter from a cousin in Bath that was mostly about the weather. She set them aside. The sketchbook. She paged through it slowly this time, not looking at the drawings but at the margins, at the small notes her mother sometimes made beside the sketches. A date here, a name there. On the last page, tucked into the back cover, folded so many times it had become almost nothing, a letter. Myra unfolded it carefully, the paper gone soft as cloth at the creases. The handwriting was not her mother's. It was small and precise and slightly slanted, the hand of someone who had been taught to write by someone serious, and at the bottom, below 3 paragraphs Myra read twice to be sure she understood, was a signature. Margaret, Duchess of Harwick. Myra sat very still. The letter was dated 16 years ago. Her mother would have been 26. The Duchess, the Duke's mother, would have been, Myra calculated quickly, perhaps 40. She read it again. The first paragraph was personal, warm, affectionate, the kind of language that meant a long friendship and a shared history. The Duchess wrote about missing her, about wishing the distance were not so great, about a winter that had been hard on her joints. The second paragraph was different. I have spoken with my husband's solicitor as I promised. The matter of your mother's estate is not as settled as your husband believes. There are documents, I have seen copies, that suggest the original bequest was altered after your mother's death and not by her hand. I cannot prove this yet, but I am trying. You deserve to know what was taken from you, Anne. You deserve to have it back." Myra's hand was not steady anymore. She read the third paragraph. "In the meantime, I am sending the ring. I know what it means to give it away. It has been in our family longer than I have, but I am sending it because I want you to have something that cannot be taken, something that is simply yours. And because if anything should happen before I can finish what I have started, I want there to be a record, a visible one, something that says, these two women knew each other. These two women trusted each other. And what was taken from one of them was not forgotten by the other. Wear it, my darling. And if your daughters inherit it someday, tell them what it means. Tell them there are people in this world who will remember." Myra set the letter down on the desk. Outside, the evening had gone fully dark. The house was quiet. Her father's study light still showed under the door at the end of the hall. She could see it from here, the thin yellow line of it, the light of a man who thought he had won something today and was sitting with that feeling. He did not know about the letter. He had never known about the letter. And he had certainly never known, because her mother had never told him, had hidden it here in this desk in this room he never entered, that the Duchess of Harwick had spent the last years of her friendship with Anne Voss trying to prove that someone had altered Anne's mother's will. Myra looked at the ring. Then she looked at the letter. Then slowly, with the particular calm that comes not from feeling nothing but from feeling too much all at once, she folded the letter back along its creases and placed it in her pocket. She had a great deal to think about, and she suspected, so did the Duke. The Duke's second visit was not announced. That was the first thing. He sent no card, no note, no footman ahead with careful phrasing. He simply arrived 3 days later at 11 in the morning, when the house was still in the particular disorder of a household that has not yet decided what kind of day it intends to have. Myra was in the garden. Not the front garden, the back one, the small, neglected one that had been her mother's and had since been left to make its own decisions. She went there most mornings when the weather allowed. She told no one this. It had never seemed relevant. The housekeeper found her there, and delivered the news with the expression of a woman caught between two forces she did not fully understand. "His Grace the Duke of Harwick is in the drawing-room," she said. Your father is still dressing. He asks that you—" "I'll go," Myra said. She went as she was. She had garden dirt on her gloves and her hair was not arranged and her dress was 3 years old and perfectly decent. She decided, pulling off the gloves as she walked, that she did not particularly care. The Duke was standing at the window when she came in. He turned when he heard her, and his eyes moved over her once, the practical dress, the loose hair, the absence of any of the social armor women were expected to wear when dukes arrived unexpectedly, and he said nothing about any of it. "Miss Myra," he said, "forgive the intrusion." "You don't seem sorry," she said. The edge of his mouth moved. "No, I suppose I don't." She sat. He sat across from her. No tea had been brought yet because the household was still reorganizing itself around his presence, which gave the room a rare quality, 2 people simply in a space together, without the furniture of social ritual arranged between them. "I've been doing some research," the Duke said. "Into what?" "Your mother," Myra kept her face still, "and her name before marriage was Voss," he said, "which you told me. What you may not know, or perhaps you do, I find I cannot predict what you know, is that the Voss family had a significant estate in Wiltshire. Land, property, a house that has been in the family for 140 years. He paused. "Your mother was an only child. Her mother, your grandmother, died when your mother was 19. "I know this," Myra said carefully. "Do you know that your grandmother left a will, a beat?" "I assumed she did." "She did," the Duke said. "I have seen a copy of it. My mother kept one. I found it in her correspondence 2 days ago after he started again. My mother kept records of everything. It was a quality I found excessive when I was young and have been grateful for every year since. He looked at her directly. In your grandmother's original will, the Wiltshire estate and its income were left in their entirety to your mother, Anne Voss, her only child. Myra's hands were very still in her lap. In their entirety, she repeated. Yes. And yet my mother had nothing when she married my father, nothing of her own, nothing she ever spoke of having. No, the Duke said, she would not have, because 6 months after your grandmother died, a second document appeared, a codicil attached to the original will transferring the estate to a male cousin your grandmother had seen perhaps 4 times in her life. He paused. The codicil was witnessed, dated correctly, filed with the appropriate authorities. But Myra said, because there was clearly a but. But my mother did not believe it was genuine. She had known your grandmother. She told me once, I was perhaps 15, and she was telling me this as a lesson about the kind of men who exist in the world, that she had never in her life met a woman more certain of what she wanted to leave behind. Your grandmother had told her explicitly that everything would go to Anne, not to a cousin she barely knew, not to anyone else. He looked at the ring on Myra's finger. My mother spent several years trying to prove the codicil was forged. She could not get far enough. The cousin had resources, connections, people whose cooperation could be purchased. She ran out of time. She died, Myra said. Yes, 4 years after your mother did. Something moved across his face. Within the same year as it happens. It was not a good year. The room was quiet for a moment. Myra thought about the letter in her pocket. She had carried it there every day since she found it. A habit she couldn't explain except that it felt important to keep it close. She thought about her mother's face in those last days, the things she had said and the things she hadn't, the particular weight of a secret a person carries so long it becomes part of their posture. She knew, Myra said quietly. My mother knew the estate should have been hers. I believe so. And she said nothing, all those years. She married my father, she lived in this house, she said nothing. What would she have said? The Duke's voice was not unkind. To whom? Your father, he let the question sit. They both knew the answer. Myra looked at the window. The garden was just visible from here, the overgrown edges of it, the roses her mother had planted that no one had pruned since. She thought about a woman who had come to her marriage with nothing, who had watched something rightfully hers be taken and had found no recourse, no ally, no door that would open except one. One friend. One woman who had believed her and tried and run out of time. And who had sent a ring so there would be a record, something visible, something that said, this was not forgotten. She did not realize she was pressing her hand against her pocket, until she felt the paper crinkle under her fingers. Your Grace, she said, I need to show you something. She took out the letter. She had thought in the 3 days since she found it about whether to show it to anyone. She had thought about it from every angle she possessed, and she had come back every time to the same place. His mother had written it. Whatever this letter contained, whatever it meant, he had a right to see his mother's handwriting. She held it out. He took it, unfolded it with the careful hands of someone who understood old paper, and read. She watched his face. He was, she had already established, not a man who gave much away. But the letter did something to him that she could see even through all that careful control, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, something that looked, briefly and only briefly, like grief. He read it twice. She could tell because his eyes moved back to the top. When he lowered it, he looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She finished it, he said finally. She told me she couldn't finish it. In her last month, she told me she had tried and failed and she was sorry. His voice was even, entirely even. She didn't tell me she had written it down. Perhaps she wanted you to find it yourself, Myra said, when the time was right. Or when the right person was in the room. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have just understood something at the same time. It was broken by the door. Lord Ashwell entered, dressed now, composed, with the particular energy of a man who has had 20 minutes to think and has arrived at a strategy. He looked at the Duke. He looked at Myra. He looked at the letter in the Duke's hand and did not recognize it, but his eyes sharpened anyway, the way a man's eyes sharpen when he sees something he cannot immediately categorize. "Your Grace," he said warmly, spreading his hands, "I apologize for keeping you. Had I known you were coming, I would have." "Sit down, Lord Ashwell," the Duke said, not unkindly, not loudly, but Lord Ashwell sat down. "I'd like to discuss," the Duke said, folding the letter with the same care he had used to open it, "the terms of your late wife's family estate." The color left Lord Ashwell's face so completely and so quickly that Myra, who had spent 20 years watching this man manage every room he entered, felt something shift in her chest. He knew. He had always known. She could see it, in the way his hands went still on his knees, in the way his eyes moved to her and then away. In the half-second of calculation she watched him perform before he assembled his face back into something composed. He knew exactly what estate the Duke meant, and he had known for 20 years that it should not have gone the way it did. Myra looked at her father and felt something she had not expected. Not anger. She had expected anger. Something colder than anger. Something that had no name yet but settled into her bones and made her sit very straight and breathe very evenly and wait. The Duke was still looking at Lord Ashwell. "I believe," he said pleasantly, "we have rather a lot to discuss." It was that evening, after the Duke had left and supper had been a silent and terrible affair, that the letter arrived. Not the Duchess's letter. Myra still had that. A different one, written in her father's hand, sealed with his ring, addressed to the Duke of Harwick. She found out about it later, through the housekeeper, who told her not because she was disloyal to Lord Ashwell, but because she had worked in this house for 23 years and had loved Myra's mother, and had made her own private decisions about where her loyalties actually lived. The letter, the housekeeper told her, had been sent by private messenger an hour after supper. In it, and the housekeeper had not read it, but she had heard Lord Ashwell dictating it to himself in his study, the way he always did when he was composing something he considered important. Lord Ashwell had written to the Duke with a detailed account of his younger daughter. Her instability, her unsociable nature, her tendency toward inappropriate behavior and embarrassing frankness, her lack of accomplishments, her lack of grace, her lack of everything a woman of her position ought to have cultivated by the age of 20. He had written, the housekeeper said, her voice carefully flat, "I feel it my duty as her father to ensure your Grace is fully informed before any further association is pursued. Myra is, I am afraid, quite unfit for the society in which you move. I would not wish to see a man of your standing misled." The housekeeper stopped there. She did not need to say more. Myra sat with this information for a long moment. She thought about her mother, who had known exactly what kind of man she had married and had still found ways to love this house, this garden, this life, who had kept a letter in a hidden drawer for 16 years and pressed a ring into her daughter's hand and asked her to hold on to it. She thought about what it meant that her father had done this. Not that he wanted Cecily to make a good match. She had known that, had always known it, had never held it fully against him. But that he had chosen to do it this way. That when cornered, when afraid, when faced with the possibility of losing control of something he thought he owned, he had picked up a pen and written those words about his own daughter and sent them into the world. She did not cry. She had not cried in a very long time, and she was not going to start now. She went to her room. She sat at her window. She looked at the ring in the thin evening light, the small gold band that had traveled from a duchess to her mother to her, that had crossed years and grief and distance to end up here on this hand in this room. And she made a decision. She would not fight her father. She would not argue or plead or spend herself trying to make him into something he was not. She would simply leave. She packed one bag. Not because she had only one bag worth of things, she had more, accumulated over 20 years in this house, books and small objects and the remnants of a childhood that had been, in its early years, genuinely happy. But she had thought carefully about what she was doing, and she had decided that leaving with one bag was important. Not as a statement, not for anyone else to see, for herself. Because one bag meant she was not taking the house with her. She was not carrying the weight of it on her back out the door. She was stepping out of it the way you step out of a room cleanly and closing the door behind her. She took the practical things, 2 dresses, both her own and both decent. Her mother's letters, all of them, the ones from the desk and the Duchess's letter and the small notes she had found tucked into books over the years, the accumulated evidence of a woman who had lived quietly and thought deeply and left more behind than anyone had noticed. A book, her mother's sketchbook. The small amount of money she had saved over 4 years from the household accounts, not stolen. She had been given a small allowance for personal expenses and had spent almost none of it, which her father had never thought to wonder about. And the ring, which had never left her finger and was not going to start now. She wrote 2 notes. The first was to Cecily. It was the hardest thing she wrote, harder than she expected, because Cecily was not the villain of this story, even though she had sometimes been its instrument. Cecily had been shaped by the same house, the same father, the same slow pressure of a life that rewarded certain things and punished others, and she had adapted in the way people adapt by becoming very good at what was rewarded. That was not wickedness. That was survival of a particular kind. I am not angry with you, she wrote. I want you to know that first. What father did was his doing, not yours, and I understand the difference. I am going to mother's property. Yes, there is one. I will explain everything when I can. I am safe. Please don't tell father where I've gone until morning. That is the only thing I'm asking. Take care of yourself, Cease. You are cleverer than you let people see. You might consider letting them see it more. The second note was for the Duke. She sat with this one for a long time. The candle burned down a 1/4 inch while she thought about what to say and what not to say. She did not want to explain herself. She did not owe him an explanation. They had spoken twice and she searched for the right word and settled on attentive, which was accurate and also the most dangerous thing he could have been, but attentiveness was not a claim. And whatever his mother had intended by keeping that letter, by saving that ring, by writing pay attention, it was not a transaction. It was not a debt Myra owed. She wrote, Your Grace. You came here looking for something practical and found something complicated instead. I am sorry for that, though I suspect you are less sorry than you ought to be. I have decided to remove myself from the situation before it becomes any more complicated. This is not a decision made in distress. I am quite calm. I am simply tired of being arranged. The letter is yours if you want it. I have made a copy. What you do with the information it contains is your business. What I do with my life from this point forward is mine. I hope you find what you came here looking for. I mean that sincerely. She read it back. Added one line at the bottom after a pause. Tell me if you ever find out what your mother couldn't finish. I'd like to know how the story ends. She sealed it, addressed it to Harwick House in London, where she had gathered from context he was staying. She left it with the housekeeper, who took it without a word and held it in both hands with the care of a woman who understood what she was holding. Then Myra picked up her bag and walked out. Her mother's property was not grand. She had known it existed, vaguely, distantly, the way you know things that have never been made real for you because her mother had mentioned it once years ago, so briefly and so carefully that Myra had almost missed it. There is a small place in the country, she had said in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, that belongs to me. It was my aunt's. It's very small, but it's mine. She had said the last word with a quietness that had nothing to do with volume. Myra had not forgotten it. It had taken her 3 years of careful, patient searching through her mother's things to find the deed, hidden, predictably in the same desk, behind a panel in the back of the bottom drawer that took her 4 separate examinations to find. The property was in Surrey, a small house on 2 acres. A cottage, really, by anyone's assessment, but a cottage with a deed in her mother's name that her father had apparently never known about because her mother's aunt had been a private and eccentric woman who communicated directly with solicitors and trusted no one else. Myra had written to those solicitors 18 months ago. She had done it carefully. She had used a friend's address in the village and signed the letter with her mother's name and asked only whether the property still existed and to whom it currently belonged. The response had taken 6 weeks and had been the most important piece of paper she had received in her life up to that point. The property at Wren Cottage, Surrey, remains in the name of Anne Voss Ashwell, and upon her death passes to her surviving issue. We have been awaiting contact from the estate. Her mother had left it to her. Her father had never known it existed. She had said nothing. She had filed the solicitor's letter in the same hidden panel behind the same drawer, and she had waited because she had not been ready, and because you do not leave until you know where you are going. She knew now. The cottage was exactly what the word suggested. Small, stone-faced, set back from a narrow lane with a garden that had been tended by a neighbor, the solicitors paid a small amount to keep from becoming a complete wilderness. Inside, 4 rooms, low ceilings, windows that let in more light than she expected, and the smell of a house that had been empty for a long time but had good bones and no damp. Myra stood in the middle of the main room with her one bag and looked around. It was the smallest space she had lived in. It was also, she realized, the first space she had ever lived in that was entirely her own. She set the bag down. She opened the window. She stood there for a while, looking at the garden, at the Surrey countryside in the pale morning light, at a wren that had landed on the garden wall and was regarding her with the frank curiosity of a creature that owned the place. She felt something she could not immediately name. Not happiness exactly, not yet, something earlier than happiness, something that was the precondition of happiness, the ground that had to exist before anything could be planted. She felt solid. She had been there 11 days when the Duke's letter arrived. She almost did not open it. She stood in the cottage doorway with it in her hands, his handwriting on the outside, strong and slightly impatient looking, like a man who wrote quickly because his thoughts moved faster than the pen, and she thought about what it might contain and whether she was ready for it. She opened it. It was not what she expected. It was not formal. It was not the careful, structured language of a man managing a situation. It was the language of someone who had sat down and written without drafting it first, which she could tell because there were 2 crossed-out words in the second paragraph, and he had not bothered to rewrite the whole thing. He had received her note, he wrote. He had read it several times. He had then, he said, done something he had not done in a number of years. He had sat in his library for 4 hours without conducting any business. He did not explain what he had been thinking about during those 4 hours. He simply stated that it had happened, as a fact, the way you state facts that are relevant without being comfortable. He had read the Duchess's letter again. He had gone through his mother's correspondence more thoroughly. He had found 3 more letters. He said, letters she had written to your mother that were apparently never sent, which suggested she had known, toward the end, that she was running out of time and had perhaps been trying to write something final and had not managed it. I will not describe them in detail, he wrote. They are private, but I want you to know they exist and that what my mother felt about your mother was not a small thing, not a passing acquaintance, something that mattered very much to her and that she kept close, even when keeping it was difficult. Then, you wrote that you'd like to know how the story ends. I find I am not yet sure it has ended. I find I am also not sure it is only their story. Then, after a space, I am not going to ask where you are. That seems like information you shared with no one for good reason, and I have no interest in being another person who decides he has the right to know where you are. But I would like to write to you if you are willing, through whatever address you prefer. My mother told me to pay attention. I am trying to do that. Harwick Myra read it twice. Then she sat down at the small table by the window, the one that caught the afternoon light, and she looked at the garden for a long time. The wren was back on the wall. She thought about a woman in a room running out of time trying to write something she needed to say. She thought about a ring that had traveled from hand to hand across years, carrying something forward. She thought about the Duke sitting in his library for 4 hours. She got up, found paper, sat back down. "Your Grace," she wrote. Then she stopped. Crossed it out, started again. "Harwick, you may write to me. The address at the bottom of this letter will find me. I should tell you, I am well. The cottage is small and the garden is in a state of some disorder, and there is a wren who appears to believe she was here first, which she probably was. I have no complaints. You said you're not sure the story has ended. I think that depends on what kind of story it turns out to be. I suppose we'll find out." She sealed it before she could reconsider. Then she went back to the window. The wren had brought a friend. The letters came every week. Not every day, she had half expected every day, from a man who seemed to have made up his mind about something and was not accustomed to waiting. But every week, reliably, on Tuesdays, as though he had set aside a specific hour for it, and was treating the correspondence with the same deliberate intention he apparently brought to everything else he did. She read the first 3 with her guard fully up. She could not help it. 20 years in her father's house had taught her that attention from powerful people was rarely simple, that it came with a shape underneath it, a purpose, a direction it was moving you toward whether you understood it or not. She read his letters looking for that shape, looking for the place where the agenda revealed itself, where the careful language slipped and showed what he was actually after. She did not find it. What she found instead was a person, which was not what she had expected. He wrote about his estate, which was larger than anything Myra had any real frame of reference for, and the complications of managing it, which were apparently numerous and frequently absurd. He wrote about a tenant dispute that had lasted 11 years before he inherited it and had continued for 3 years after, and the resolution of which had involved a surveyor, 2 lawyers, a very old map, and a pig that had wandered into the wrong field at a pivotal moment. He wrote about this with a dry humor that she had not anticipated and that made her, the first time she encountered it, read the paragraph twice to be sure she had understood correctly. He wrote about London, which he visited when required and left as soon as he was able. He wrote about his mother. Not often, not at length, but occasionally carefully, a detail here and there, something she had said, something she had kept, something he had found in the process of going through her correspondence that had surprised him. He wrote about her the way a person writes about a grief that has settled but not dissolved, that has become part of the architecture of daily life rather than an acute wound. With matter-of-factness that was, Myra recognized, its own kind of tenderness. She wrote back. She had told herself she would be brief, measured. She would provide enough to be polite and not enough to be vulnerable, which was the calculation she had made for most of her adult life and which had served her adequately if not warmly. She was not brief. She did not know, afterward, exactly when it happened, which letter, which particular Tuesday. But somewhere in the 3rd week or the 4th, she stopped calculating and simply wrote, and what came out was more than she had said to any person in years. She wrote about the cottage, which she had begun to restore room by room with methodical satisfaction. She wrote about the garden, which was revealing itself slowly. What had seemed like chaos turning out to have an underlying structure, her mother's aunt apparently having had opinions about where things should grow even if she had not communicated them to anyone. She wrote about the wren, who had been joined by a second wren and then a third, as though word had gotten out. She wrote about her mother. About what it felt like to live in a space her mother had owned, that her mother had perhaps imagined living in herself someday, not as an escape, exactly, but as a possibility. A door she had kept unlocked even when everything else was bolted shut. She wrote about finding in the back of the bedroom cupboard a small watercolor her mother had painted of the garden, which meant she had been here, had stood in this space and looked at this view and thought it worth keeping. She had not expected that. She had sat on the bedroom floor for a long time with the watercolor in her lap. The Duke wrote back, "I am glad you found it. I think she would be glad you're there." It was a simple sentence. She had no idea why it affected her the way it did. The letter from Cecily arrived in the 5th week. Myra had wondered when it would come. She had sent her sister a brief note after settling in safe, well, address enclosed, and had received nothing back, which she had interpreted as either shock or her father's interference or both. The letter, when it finally arrived, was long. Cecily wrote the way she did everything, with grace and a kind of careful beauty, sentences that moved smoothly and never stumbled. But underneath the grace, Myra could feel something unfamiliar, something ragged at the edges. She was sorry, Cecily wrote. Not in the general way, not as a formality. Specifically sorry, with specific things named the night of the gray dress, which Cecily had known about and said nothing. The years of small erasures, the way their father had managed the household so that Cecily was visible and Myra was not, and the way Cecily had accepted the visibility without asking what it cost. I told myself you didn't mind, she wrote. I think I told myself that because it was easier than knowing you did. She wrote about their father. He was not well, she said. Not physically, he was perfectly healthy, which was almost annoying. But the Duke had done something. Cecily didn't know the details, only the effects, which had manifested as a series of very serious meetings with very serious men that had lasted 2 weeks and resulted in their father spending his evenings in the study in a silence that was different from his usual silence. More interior, more afraid. He asked about you, Cecily wrote, once. He asked if I had heard from you and I said no. I'm not sorry I lied. Then, at the end, almost as an afterthought, tucked into the final paragraph like something she had been building toward without admitting it. The Duke came to the house last week. Father was not here. He asked for me, which I thought was strange, and we talked for an hour in the blue drawing room. He asked about you, what you were like when you were young, what mother was like. He listened in that way he has, you know the way I mean, where you feel quite certain he is hearing everything including the parts you didn't say. I don't know what he's planning, Myra. But I don't think it's nothing. Please write back. I miss you. I didn't know how much until you were gone. Myra read this letter 3 times. Then she wrote back to Cecily, a proper letter, long, with everything in it that should have been said years ago and some things she hadn't known she needed to say until she was saying them. It took her all afternoon. She did not mention the Duke, but she thought about him for the rest of the evening. In the 7th week, the letters stopped. Tuesday came and went. No letter. Myra told herself it meant nothing. He was busy. He was traveling. He had 1,000 responsibilities she had no view of, an entire life that existed outside their correspondence, and she had no claim on any of it. She had been very clear with herself about that, very rational and very clear. Wednesday came and went. Thursday. She caught herself on Friday morning looking out the cottage window at the lane, which was completely unreasonable, and she knew it and continued doing it anyway. Nothing on Friday. Nothing on Saturday. On Sunday, she went into the garden and spent 4 hours doing aggressive things to the hedgerow, which needed it but not quite that urgently. On Monday, she sat down and wrote a letter she did not send, then tore it up, then felt foolish about having torn it up, then felt more foolish about feeling foolish. On Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the last letter, she was in the kitchen when she heard a carriage on the lane. She did not look out the window. She was very deliberate about not looking out the window. She heard the carriage stop. She heard footsteps on the garden path, measured, unhurried, with the particular rhythm of someone who is not rushing because they have made a decision and are simply executing it. The knock at the door was exactly what she would have expected if she had been expecting anything, which she wasn't. She opened it. The Duke of Harwick was standing in her garden path, slightly windswept from what had evidently been a long journey, in traveling clothes that were practical and well-made, and gave him the look of a man who had not particularly concerned himself with how he arrived, only that he did. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You stopped writing," she said. "I know." He held up the leather case he was carrying. "I found something. I thought it was better delivered in person." She stepped back from the door. He came in. He sat at the small table by the window, the one she wrote her letters at, the one with the good afternoon light. And he opened the leather case and took out a document that was clearly very old, the paper gone amber at the edges, the ink faded to a reddish brown. Myra sat across from him and waited. "I hired a man," the Duke said. "An investigator, someone who specializes in legal documents, estates, that sort of work. I gave him everything my mother had kept and asked him to finish what she started." He paused. "It took him 6 weeks. This is what he found." He turned the document to face her. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading. It was a legal record, a registration, formal and official, from a court of chancery, dated 23 years ago. The original will of Margaret Eleanor Voss, her grandmother, filed and registered, not the altered version, the original, with a notation beside it in a different ink, a later hand, original document recovered. Subsequent codicil dated date found to bear forged witness signatures. Matter referred for further inquiry. Myra looked up. "He found the original filing," the Duke said. "The codicil was forged, my mother was right. She had simply not been able to get the right people to look at the right documents. The witness signatures on the codicil were from 2 men who had both died before the date on the document, which is, as my investigator put it with admirable restraint, quite irregular." "The estate," Myra said. Her voice was very even. "My grandmother's estate." "Should have gone to your mother," the Duke said. "And from your mother to you." He looked at her steadily. "It is a significant property, Myra. Land, income, a house that has been tenanted for 20 years at a rent that has been going to the wrong family for all of that time. The wrong family." She thought about the cousin, the man she had never met, who had apparently spent 23 years living on income that belonged to her mother and then to her, who had perhaps never thought about it at all, or perhaps had thought about it and decided not to think about it, which were different forms of the same thing. She thought about her mother, standing in this cottage, painting a watercolor of the garden, keeping a deed in a hidden drawer, carrying a letter from a duchess about a forged codicil, and saying nothing because there was nowhere to say it, because saying it would cost more than she had. She thought about what her mother could have had, what life she could have lived if someone had found these documents 20 years earlier. She pressed her hand flat against the table. "What happens now?" she said. "My solicitors have filed the appropriate documents. The cousin's family will be notified. There will likely be a period of legal dispute. They will not accept this easily. It means returning 20 years of rental income and vacating the property, but the evidence is, my investigator tells me, unambiguous." He paused. "It will take time. These things always do, but the outcome is not in doubt." Myra looked at the document, at her grandmother's name, written in ink that had faded to rust over 23 years, at the notation in the different hand, original document recovered, those 3 words that contained inside them the entire weight of what had been taken and what was being given back. "Your mother tried to do this," she said. "Yes." "She ran out of time." "Yes." "And you finished it." The Duke was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in the way she had come to recognize, not cold but controlled, managing something interior. "She asked me to pay attention," he said. "I think this is what she meant." Myra looked at him across the small table, in the afternoon light, in the cottage that had been her mother's and was now hers, with the document between them and the garden visible through the window, and the wren on the wall outside going about her business, with characteristic indifference to the enormity of the moment. She had spent 20 years in a house where she was arranged and managed and positioned for other people's purposes. She had spent 20 years learning to make herself small enough not to be a problem, visible enough not to be forgotten, and the tension of those 2 requirements had become so familiar she had stopped feeling it the way you stop feeling the weight of something you always carry. She felt it now, felt it lift. "I need a moment," she said. "Take whatever you need." She got up, went to the window, stood with her back to him, looking at the garden, at the afternoon light coming through the apple tree her mother's aunt had planted 40 years ago, at the wren who had looked up briefly at the movement and then returned to ignoring everything. She breathed. She did not cry, because she had not cried in a very long time, and she was not going to start in front of the Duke of Harwick. But something in her chest shifted, moved, made room for something it had been keeping out for years. When she turned back, she was composed. He had not moved. He was sitting at her table looking at her with that expression she had been trying to read since the first day, the one that was careful on the surface and something older underneath, something that had been waiting in a locked room. She looked at it and finally, standing in her mother's cottage with her mother's ring on her finger, she understood what it was. He was afraid. Not of her, not of the situation. He was afraid of the thing he wanted, the way people are afraid of things that matter too much to be casual about. He had that look, the look of a man who has been careful and controlled for a long time and has encountered something he cannot be careful about, and is managing that fact with every tool he has. She recognized it because she had been wearing the same expression for 6 weeks. "Harwick," she said. "Yes." "Why did you come yourself?" He looked at her. "I could have sent a solicitor with the documents." "Yes." "I was aware of that." And a pause, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because I have been sitting in my library for 6 weeks writing letters to a woman in a cottage in Surrey about a wren and a watercolor and my mother, and somewhere in the middle of that, I realized that I was not doing it out of obligation or duty, or any of the other things I am quite practiced at doing." He stopped. "I was doing it because it was the best part of my week." The afternoon light moved across the table between them. "That's a very honest thing to say," Myra said. "I find I've become more honest recently. I'm not entirely sure how it happened." She almost smiled, the edge of it. "I may have some responsibility for that." "Almost certainly." She sat back down, across the table from him, close enough that she could see the slight tension in his jaw, the control, the carefulness, the thing he was managing. She folded her hands on the table. "I am not my father's daughter," she said. "I mean that in every sense. I will not be arranged. I will not be managed. I will not be positioned in a room for someone else's purpose." She looked at him steadily. "I have a cottage and a garden and an estate that is apparently being returned to me, and I am, for the first time in my life, entirely my own." "I know," he said. "I need you to understand that that is not something I will give up, not for anyone. I would not ask you to." "People say that." "I know they do." He met her eyes. "I am not asking you to give up anything. I am sitting in your cottage at your table in a house that is yours, asking if I might continue, whatever this is, whatever it has been for the last 6 weeks." He paused. "At whatever pace you require, on whatever terms make sense to you." Myra looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her mother, who had loved a man who took things, and had never had this, had never had someone sit across a table and say on whatever terms make sense to you and mean it. She thought about the ring, traveling from hand to hand across years, carrying something forward. She thought about a woman writing letters she never sent, running out of time, trying to finish something. "Tuesday," she said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Your letters always came on Tuesdays." She picked up the old document from the table, held it carefully, set it back down. "I noticed when they stopped." Something moved across his face, the locked room opening. "I noticed too," he said quietly. Outside, the wren sang once sharp and clear and entirely unconcerned with the weight of the moment. And the afternoon light shifted, and the apple tree moved in a small wind, and the cottage held them both in its 4 small rooms the way a space holds things that belong in it. "Stay for dinner," Myra said. "It won't be grand. I have a woman from the village who comes in the mornings but not the evenings." "I don't need grand." "No," she said, looking at him. "I don't think you do." She got up to start dinner. He sat at her table in her cottage in the afternoon light. And for the first time since she had walked out of her father's house with one bag, the space did not feel like hers alone. It felt, quietly and without announcement, like something was beginning. The legal proceedings took 4 months. Myra knew this because she counted them, not anxiously, not with the helpless attention of someone waiting for something they cannot influence, but with the practical awareness of a woman who has learned that time is a resource and should be treated as one. She knew where things stood. She received regular correspondence from the Duke's solicitors, written in the dense formal language of men who dealt in documents and precedent and found ordinary words somewhat imprecise for their purposes. She had learned to read between the lines of it, which was a skill not entirely unlike reading between the lines of her father's dinner table conversation, though the stakes were different. The cousins' family contested, as expected. They had retained their own lawyers, who wrote letters suggesting that the recovered document was itself suspect, that the witness signatures had been misread, that the notation in the Chancery record was a clerical anomaly rather than an evidentiary finding. These arguments were, the Duke's solicitor wrote to Myra with admirable restraint, not expected to succeed. They were the arguments of people who know they have lost and are spending money to delay that knowledge becoming official. Myra read these updates at her table by the window and felt something she had not expected to feel: patience. A deep, untroubled patience like a stone in a river. The water moved around her. The outcome was not in doubt. She could wait. What she did with the 4 months was live in them. She finished restoring the cottage. The bedroom first, then the sitting room, then the small second room she had initially left empty, and eventually decided to turn into something between a library and a study, shelves along 2 walls. Her mother's sketchbook on the center shelf where she could see it. Her own books arranged by no system, except the one that made sense to her, which she had concluded was the only valid system for personal libraries. She hired a woman from the village full-time, a practical and unimpressible person named Mrs. Holt, who had worked for 3 households before this one, and had apparently found all 3 of them wanting in various ways. She regarded Myra with initial skepticism, which Myra respected, and within 3 weeks had shifted to something that was not quite warmth, but was the thing that comes before warmth and is, in some ways, more reliable. She wrote to Cecily every week. The letters between them had become something neither of them had quite had before, not the cautious affection of sisters who live in the same house and must manage each other around a difficult father, but something more direct, more honest. Cecily was finding, she wrote, that honesty was both harder and considerably more interesting than she had previously given it credit for. She had told their father at dinner, 3 weeks after Myra left, exactly what she thought of the letter he had sent to the Duke. She reported this with the slightly stunned tone of someone who has done something surprising and is still assessing the aftermath. Their father had not spoken to her for 5 days. On the 6th day, he had come to breakfast and behaved normally, which was almost more unsettling. "He is diminished," Cecily wrote in the careful way she wrote things she was still working out. "I don't mean physically. I mean he seems smaller than he used to. I used to think he filled every room he walked into. Now I notice the parts of the room he doesn't fill. Is that terrible of me?" Myra wrote back, "No, it's accurate. There's a difference. The Duke came on Tuesdays. Not every Tuesday. He had an estate and responsibilities and a life that could not be indefinitely arranged around a cottage in Surrey, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But most Tuesdays, reliably, the carriage appeared on the lane and he came in without ceremony and sat at the table by the window or walked in the garden, or, on one occasion when the roof over the small hallway developed a disagreement with the weather, stood on a ladder for 2 hours doing something practical and competent that Myra found deeply unreasonable to watch without comment. She commented. He took the commentary with equanimity. Their conversations were, she thought, unlike any she had had with anyone. They argued about books. They argued about land management, about which she had developed opinions she had not expected to develop, and about which he had the kind of practical knowledge that comes from actually dealing with land rather than simply owning it. They talked about his mother and hers, carefully, with the care of people handling something precious. The shape of two women moving through their conversations the way the dead move through the lives of people who loved them, present in the periphery, informing everything. He did not push. She had expected, somewhere in the first weeks, to find the edge of his patience, the place where the measured consideration gave way to expectation, to the quiet pressure of a man who has decided he wants something and finds the wanting uncomfortable. She had encountered that edge in other people. She knew what it felt like. She did not find it in him. He was simply there, present, consistent, interested in her actual opinions rather than the performance of them, capable of sitting in a silence without needing to fill it, which was rarer than people understood. He brought her things occasionally, a book he thought she'd argue with, which she invariably did. Once, a cutting from a plant he'd found in his greenhouse that he thought would do well in her garden, which it did. He never brought flowers. She didn't know if he'd worked out that she would find flowers slightly absurd or if it was simply not his instinct. Either way, she appreciated it. She admitted to herself in the 5th week, extremely careful not to admit how much she appreciated it. She admitted in the 7th week, failing at this. She admitted in the 9th week, not particularly trying anymore. Lord Ashwell arrived on a Wednesday. She had not invited him. She had not told him where she was. She had relied on the assumption, which turned out to be correct, that Cecily would eventually tell him, and that he would eventually come, and that it was better to let this happen on its own timeline than to spend energy managing it. She heard the carriage and looked out the window and recognized the crest and felt, very briefly, the old instinct, the one that had lived in her chest for 20 years, the brace and diminish response, make yourself smaller, take up less space, give him less to push against. She felt it. She let it pass through her. Then she went to the door and opened it before he could knock. He looked older. Cecily had said he seemed smaller, and Myra saw what she meant. Something had gone out of him in the month since she had left, some quality of certainty that had always been the engine of him, the thing that had filled the rooms. He was still upright, still well-dressed, still the man who knew how to arrange his face for any audience. But he was standing in her garden, looking at her cottage with the expression of a man who has lost a version of reality he depended on, and has not yet found another one to stand in. "Myra," he said. "Father," she said. She stepped back from the door. She did not say come in. She left the space open and let him decide, which was a small thing and also not a small thing. He came in. He looked around the cottage, at the shelves she had built, the books arranged in her own system, the watercolor hung on the wall above the fireplace, her mother's garden visible through the back window. She watched him see the watercolor and watched something cross his face that she could not read and did not try to. She made tea because it was what you did, and because having something practical to do with her hands was useful. They sat at the table. He began, as she had expected, with the legal situation. He had received correspondence from the Duke's solicitors. He understood that there were documents. He had consulted his own people, who had told him, in the careful language of lawyers delivering unwelcome news, that the matter was not favorable. He said all of this in the tone of a man presenting a business problem. "Yes," Myra said. "The Wiltshire estate was my grandmother's, was left to my mother, was taken through a forged document." She kept her voice level. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know the document was forged," he said. She looked at him. "I knew the estate had gone to the cousin. I assumed," he stopped, started again. "Your mother believed it was not legitimate. She told me once, early in our marriage." He looked at his hands. "I told her there was nothing to be done." "Did you try to find out if there was?" A pause that told her everything. "No," he said. "No," Myra agreed. She picked up her teacup, set it down. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are here because you want something. I'm not sure what it is yet. An acknowledgement, perhaps, or absolution, or simply to see whether you still have any standing with me." She looked at him steadily. "You can tell me which one it is. I'd rather know." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something undefended. "I wanted to see if you were all right," he said. She considered this. "I'm better than all right," she said. "I have a cottage and a garden and an estate being returned to me and more books than shelves, which is the correct ratio." She paused. "I am, for the first time, exactly where I should be." He looked at the watercolor. "She painted that here," he said, quietly, almost to himself. "Yes. She told me once she had a property. I didn't," he stopped. "I didn't ask about it." "No. I should have." Myra looked at her father, at the older, diminished, still upright man who had dressed her in rags and written a letter calling her unfit and spent 20 years not asking about the things that mattered to her mother, and felt something complicated move through her. Not forgiveness. Not yet, and perhaps not entirely, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But something adjacent to it. Something that acknowledged he was a person who had failed in specific ways that had cost specific things, and that this was true and would remain true, and that she could hold it as true without letting it be the only thing. "You may visit," she said, "occasionally if you write first." She looked at him. "I am not my mother. I won't let things go unsaid because saying them is difficult. If you come here, you come to the version of me that exists now, not the one you're used to. That's the only offer I have." He nodded slowly. "Cecily misses you," he said. "I know. I'm taking her to Wiltshire when the property transfers. She's never been." She paused. "You weren't invited. That may change. It may not." He accepted this with a quiet that she recognized after a moment as something close to respect. He left an hour later. She stood in the doorway and watched the carriage go down the lane and felt the afternoon settle around her, the garden sounds returning, the birds resuming whatever they had been interrupted in, the ordinary texture of a life that was hers. Mrs. Holt appeared at her shoulder with a fresh pot of tea. "Staying for dinner?" she asked, meaning the father. "No," Myra said. "Good," said Mrs. Holt, and went back inside. The legal matter concluded on a Thursday in late October. The letter from the solicitor arrived in the morning. While Myra was in the garden with her hands in the soil of the bed, she was preparing for spring, and Mrs. Holt brought it out to her with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this particular piece of paper and is glad to see it arrive. Myra read it with dirt on her gloves. The codicil had been formally invalidated. The original will have been restored. The Wiltshire estate and its accumulated income, a figure that the solicitor listed in careful, precise numbers that Myra had to read twice because the first time she read them she thought she had misread, was formally transferred to Miss Myra Ashwell as sole surviving heir of Anne Voss Ashwell. She stood in her garden for a long time. The October light was thin and gold and came through the apple tree at an angle that made everything look like a painting. The wren was on the wall. The earth smelled of cold and turned soil and something green underneath it, the underground life of a garden getting ready to wait out the winter. She thought about her grandmother, who had made a will and had it altered. She thought about her mother, who had known and had no recourse. She thought about the Duchess, who had tried and run out of time. She thought about 3 women who had passed something forward, a letter, a ring, a record, a determination, until it reached hands that could finish the work. She pressed her hand against the earth. Then she went inside, washed her hands, sat at her table and wrote 3 letters. One to the Duke's solicitor acknowledging receipt, one to Cecily telling her to pack for Wiltshire, and one to the Duke short because it did not need to be long. "It's done. Come on Tuesday if you can. I'll make dinner. Bring the book you mentioned last week. I've been thinking about the argument you made and I've decided you're wrong, and I'd like to tell you so in person. M. P.S. The wren has built a nest in the apple tree. I thought you should know. You've heard enough about her. You may as well know she's staying." She sealed it. Then she put on her coat, went back into the garden and kept working. There was a great deal to plant. 1 year later, almost to the day, Myra stood in the garden of the Wiltshire estate and tried to decide where to put the roses. It was the kind of problem she had not expected to enjoy as much as she did. A large, practical, entirely solvable problem with dirt involved, and no one whose feelings needed managing. She had been standing here for 20 minutes with a sketch she'd made that morning, turning it different ways, arguing with herself about sun exposure and drainage and the view from the east window. And she had reached no conclusion except that the south wall was probably right, and she wanted to think about it for another 10 minutes before committing. The Wiltshire house was larger than the cottage, considerably larger. The first time she had walked through it, on a cold November morning with the solicitor and Cecily and a housekeeper who had been managing the property for the tenants and had agreed to stay on, she had gone from room to room in silence, cataloging, assessing, feeling the particular weight of a space that should have been known to her all her life and wasn't. Cecily had cried briefly in the hallway upstairs. She had done it quietly and recovered quickly and not mentioned it, which Myra had understood was its own form of grace. The cousin's family had vacated in December, which had been by all accounts not pleasant for anyone involved, and which Myra had not attended because her presence would not have improved it. She had sent the solicitor. She had stayed at the cottage and read a book and felt, not vindictively but truthfully, that justice had a texture, that it was not abstract, that it landed in the body as something physical, a settling, a realignment of something that had been slightly wrong for a long time. She had moved to Wiltshire in January. She had kept the cottage. This had caused a brief discussion with the Duke, who had raised the practical question of why a person needed two properties. Myra had explained that the cottage was her mother's and she was not giving it up, and that was the end of the discussion, because he was not a man who argued with things that were actually settled. The cottage was Mrs. Holt's domain now, largely. She had been offered the choice of coming to Wiltshire or staying, and she had looked at Myra for a long moment and said she thought she'd stay, if that was agreeable, and that she'd keep the wren's nest intact. Myra had said that was more than agreeable. Mrs. Holt had nodded with the satisfaction of a woman whose decision had been confirmed and gone back to whatever she had been doing. Cecily was in the east sitting room. Myra could see her through the window from the garden, or rather could see the shape of her, bent over a letter she was writing with the focused energy of someone who had recently discovered that she had a great deal to say and was making up for lost time. Cecily had been at Wiltshire for 3 days and would stay another 4. They had established a rhythm of it, visits, long ones, with the ease of sisters who have stopped navigating around each other and have simply begun to be honest, which is faster and more comfortable and occasionally startling. Cecily was writing to a man in Bath. She had not told Myra directly. She had mentioned him twice in letters, once obliquely and once with a studiedly casual tone that had told Myra everything she needed to know, and Myra had not asked because she understood that Cecily would tell her when she was ready and that the telling would be more genuine for not having been extracted. She was ready, Myra suspected, approximately now. She would wait. The carriage came at noon. She heard it from the garden and did not look up immediately, because she had learned in a year of Tuesdays that looking up immediately gave something away that she preferred to give on her own timeline. She made a note on her sketch about the south wall. She looked at the note. Then she looked up. He came through the gate with the particular unhurried purpose that was, she had concluded, simply how he moved through the world, not slowly, not quickly, but with the certainty of a person who has decided where they are going. He was carrying a book, which she had asked him to bring. He was also carrying something else, tucked under his arm, that she hadn't asked for and couldn't immediately identify. "You're late," she said. "By 4 minutes," he said. He looked at the sketch in her hand, the roses. "Still deciding." "South wall," he said immediately. She looked at him. "That's what I thought." "Then why are you still deciding?" "Because I wanted to arrive at it myself." She held out her hand for the book. He gave it to her. She looked at the other thing under his arm. "What's that?" He held it out. It was a frame. Old dark wood, slightly worn at the corners. Inside it, behind glass, a letter. Small handwriting, slightly slanted, the ink faded to rust. She recognized it immediately. Not the letter itself, That was upstairs in her study in the box where she kept things that mattered. This was something else. She leaned closer and read the first line. It was in the Duchess's hand, but it was not a letter she had seen before. "I found it last month," the Duke said, "in the back of a drawer in her writing desk, the desk I should have gone through properly 2 years ago and kept putting off." He paused. "It's dated a week before she died. I think it's the one she was trying to write, the one she couldn't finish." Myra looked at the framed letter, at the small, precise handwriting of a woman she had never met, who had loved her mother and tried to protect her and run out of time, who had sent a ring forward into the future on a kind of faith. The faith that things passed along carefully enough eventually reached the right hands. She read it through the glass. It was short, shorter than the others. The handwriting was less steady, she could see that, the slight unevenness of it, the hand of someone who was tired or unwell and writing anyway because it needed to be done. "I am trying to finish what I started for you," the Duchess had written. "I am not sure I will manage it. I am sorry for that. I am not sorry for trying. If this reaches Anne, I hope you are well. I hope the ring is on your finger. I hope you are less alone than I fear you might be. If this reaches someone else, if time has moved in the way time moves and you are reading this without knowing who I am, then let me tell you. There was a woman named Anne, and she deserved better than she received, and someone who loved her tried very hard to make that right. That is the whole of it. That is what I wanted to say. It is enough, I think, to have tried. I hope it is enough." Myra stood in her garden with the framed letter in her hands for a long moment. The October light was the same as it had been last year, thin and gold, coming through things at an angle. The garden was still mostly unknown to her, revealing itself slowly the way gardens do, showing her what was underneath the neglect, what had survived, what wanted to grow. "It reached someone else," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. And it was enough. She looked at the letter, more than enough. She held it for another moment. Then she looked up at him, and something in her face did what it occasionally did now, opened, simply, without the calculation of what to give and what to keep. She had gotten better at that, in a year of Tuesdays, in a year of a person who looked at her, and waited for what she actually thought rather than the managed version of it. "Thank you," she said. "She would have wanted you to have it," he said. "I think she would have wanted to know it worked." "It worked," Myra said. She looked at the ring on her finger. The small gold band, worn thin at the edges from years of wearing, warm against her skin the way only things that have been held a long time become warm. 4 women, she thought. 4 women and 1 ring and a faith that things passed along carefully enough arrive where they are meant to go. Her grandmother, who had made a will and meant it. The Duchess, who had believed her and tried. Her mother, who had hidden a deed and a letter in a desk, and pressed a ring into her daughter's palm, and asked her to hold on. And her, standing in a garden that was hers, in an estate that was hers, with a book under one arm and a framed letter in her hands, and the south wall waiting for the roses. She handed the frame back to him, carefully. "Inside," she said, "in the study on the shelf above the desk. I'll show you where." "All right." She started toward the house. He fell into step beside her, which was where he had been for a year of Tuesdays, which was where she had, somewhere in the middle of it, stopped pretending she didn't want him to be. At the door she stopped. "Harwick." "Yes." She looked at him, at the face she had been reading for a year and was still, she suspected, only partway through understanding. At the man who had sat in his library for 4 hours and written letters about a wren and finished what his mother couldn't and come to her cottage in person, because some things are better delivered by hand. "The south wall," she said. "Yes. I'll need help digging." He looked at the sketch she still had in her other hand. At the rough diagram of the garden, the south wall marked with small circles where the roses would go. Then he looked at her with the expression she had finally, in a year, learned to read completely. The locked room open. The thing that had been waiting a long time and had stopped waiting and simply was. I know, he said. That's why I came early. She raised an eyebrow. You were 4 minutes late. I was 4 minutes early to everything else. He held the door open. It evens out. She walked inside. He followed. The door closed behind them, and the garden held the afternoon quietly, and the south wall waited, and somewhere in the apple tree in Surrey, a wren sang once, sharp and clear and entirely satisfied with how things had turned out. She had worn her mother's ring for 21 years. For the first 11, it was a promise she was keeping. For the next 10, it was a secret she was carrying. Now, standing in her mother's garden in her mother's estate with her mother's watercolor on the wall upstairs and her mother's justice finally, irrevocably done, it was simply hers, as it had always been meant to be. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and share your thoughts about the story. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.